Well, you know how it is. The auto industry in Michigan sort of sets the tone for the health of the manufacturing climate and, for that matter, the economy in the state. And you probably read about it at times in the Detroit Free Press. And a lot of those perspectives have been penned by Mark Phelan, Detroit Free Press auto writer. And he joins us this morning. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Richard.
Thank you for the time today.
Always a pleasure.
So, I think the last time you and I talked was a few years ago, and at that point, we were still talking about how the auto industry had a bunch of pent-up demand, and we were going to just see an explosion in sales, and the cycle would turn the other way, and we'd be busy. I think we're there now, right?
It does seem that we were right, doesn't it?
Yeah, so are we worried now that the pendulum will swing back again?
Well, I think you always have to keep an eye on things, particularly when there's a recent example of the industry getting out ahead of its skis and selling more vehicles than was supportable. But I don't think that we have anything imminent to be concerned about. The consensus among all the people who track the numbers seems to be that this is going to be a good year. In fact, America is going to be perhaps the strongest big market in the world since the steam has gone out of China a little bit. So this looks like it should be a real good year. And it appears that the car companies have learned lessons from the mistakes they made in the past, and they're not pushing to sell more vehicles than is sustainable, although we got to keep a close eye on that to make sure that they don't push too far.
What is realistic for sales these days, and how have they adjusted their thinking on that?
Boy, it's a fascinating question, because I remember during the Great Recession, smart people who have been studying the industry for years saying, well, they'll never get past 14 million sales a year again. More than that is just unsustainable. And last year we were at almost 17 and a half, and everybody says that this year should be a little bit better. So I think it's hard to see any really big increases in sales beyond where we are now, and it seems like just maybe 1% a year, the sort of thing that mirrors the rise in the general population of the country is where we're at now. Whereas before, people were making up for lost time. There were the 3 or 4 years when the economy was falling apart, and people didn't want to take any chances. They didn't want to take on any big new expenses. So cars got old. There was that pent-up demand you were talking about. That probably is largely satisfied now, so we're just looking at a basic replacement market and growth that comes along with the growth in the general population.
It sounds like that's fairly stable, too. We're not riding this roller coaster of up and down sales.
Not so far. It does look stable. Again, just because we saw a case where large companies got very over-enthusiastic, and they got addicted to big sales numbers and just were desperate to keep the factories running at those levels. So they then started selling to people who couldn't necessarily make the payments. It was like what went wrong with the whole economy in some ways.
Right.
So you have to keep an eye on it. You don't want to get overconfident, but this is certainly a time when you can at least be confident.
We're talking with Mark Phelan, automotive writer for the Detroit Free Press. When we come back, now that Mark has sort of characterized what the industry is like, we'll talk about the American automakers, too, and how they fit into all of this and how healthy they are. That's coming up in a minute on WBCK. WBCK, Mark Phelan is with us this half hour from the Detroit Free Press, automotive writer. And so the overall industry, as you alluded, Mark, is fairly healthy right now. How about the American companies? Are they feeling that upswing as much as everybody else?
They are, for sure. GM and Ford in particular are very strong. Chrysler has always been the most limited of the three, and that's the case again at the moment. It and Fiat are probably going to end up finding some third partner to get them up to the size that a company really needs to be. But right now, sales are good. Everybody's sales have been rising steadily.
Did I see a story that was out there in the news? Maybe you wrote it about Fiat Chrysler and Sergio Marchionne sort of making overtures out there to make the company attractive to sell it?
Yes, yes. In fact, that may be one that I wrote. Sergio has said, really, essentially, since the day that he formed Fiat Chrysler, that the company still was not big enough to be a sustainable player in the global industry, that you need to be selling 6 or 7 million vehicles a year at least, and they're not at that level. And he's been looking for partners. At one point, he made a pitch to GM, which nobody but him seemed to think made sense, so that didn't go anywhere. And his latest moves have been to sort of realign the company to focus on the things that it's good at, the things that it makes lots of money on, like Jeeps and Ram pickups and minivans and muscle cars, the 300 and the Challenger. Mm-hmm. He's focusing on those, moving away from the cars that they don't do well, that they have a hard time selling, in an attempt to make it a more attractive partner. And I think there's a pretty strong chance that we'll see him forming some sort of alliance with another company to make Fiat Chrysler a bigger and more durable company.
Boy, that overture to General Motors didn't seem to make a lot of sense. GM just got through downsizing themselves, or maybe right-sizing themselves with eliminating some underperforming divisions and things. It just didn't seem like that's something they're interested in.
No. I mean, there are a couple of pieces of Fiat Chrysler that any company would love to have, Jeep and the Ram pickup business in particular. But there was too much overlap, too much similarity, I thought, between them and GM. It would have been a huge challenge to put the companies together, and it would have distracted GM from the stuff that it needs to focus on, which is getting better at the vehicles it already builds. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a wise move of GM to not to take him up on the offer.
I think it might have been John McElroy who said when Fiat and Chrysler got together that this opened the door to sell Jeeps all over the world, and thus Jeep should double its sales. Do you see it that way? And secondly, it sounds like that's not enough.
Exactly. Yes. First of all, Jeep sales have been rising tremendously over the last 5 years, but the company needs to get bigger anyway. I mean, Jeep, when Fiat Chrysler was formed, Jeep was selling probably 700,000 vehicles a year. Last year, they sold close to 1.4 million. So they've almost doubled, and they will continue to rise. They've added factories in Europe and South America and China to build their vehicles, and they're selling every vehicle that they can build. There's still a waiting list for Wranglers. The Jeep Wrangler that you and I probably see every day, that we take for granted, that's considered an incredibly desirable exotic vehicle in a lot of parts of the world. So it's a very strong brand and a very profitable brand. But it's not enough to offset the fact that Chrysler has a hard time building competitive small cars. The Dodge Dart is a good car, but it's never sold as well as they needed it to. And the same goes with the Chrysler 200. So Jeep is one of the things they have that makes them very attractive to other partners, to potential partners, and they need those partners to come in and provide small cars that Fiat Chrysler have not been able to really master yet.
Boy, that Wrangler is just something. It just goes on and on and on. I mean,
it does.
That vehicle is basically the platform of it generally is the same Willys Jeep from the Army vehicle days, right?
It's phenomenal. I mean, you can look at it, and there's an obvious, relatively short evolution in the styling of it from 1941 to today. And it's perfect. It's one of the few vehicles that is affordable for a young person who's just a couple of years out of school to get as their first new vehicle, but it's also a vehicle that people look at and they think, wow, I really like it.
It's kind of fun,
It's wonderful.
Yeah, we're talking with Mark Phelan, the Detroit Free Press auto writer. When we come back in a moment, just some thoughts about cars today that could be collectible in the future, and how do you recognize that? We'll talk about that coming up in just a second. Richard Piet Show Friday, WBCK. Mark Phelan is with us from the Detroit Free Press, automotive writer. You know, it's interesting because you mentioned at the beginning of our talk today that the American automakers, and for that matter, I think most of them have figured out the mistakes they've made in the past. And, you know, we have here in the morning show, we have a terrific relationship with Lakeview Ford, and so I spend a lot of time in Ford vehicles, but I think it's probably true that it's tough across the board to find a bad car these days, right, Mark?
Oh, it really is. And the level of technology that is even in some of the basic subcompacts includes stuff that you couldn't have dreamt of getting in a $100,000 luxury car 10 years ago.
Right. It is incredible. You know, I have an old car, too, that's almost 40 years old, and I look at that, and I look at what it has and doesn't have and compare it to today, and it's apples and bowling balls. Just completely
and the things
different.
that we take for granted, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, how do you wrote an article about this recently. What kinds of things do you consider when you're looking at a car and say to yourself, okay, there's a collectible car in the future?
Well, one of the things that is an obvious giveaway is, do people turn around for a better look at it when you drive past? That's always a good sign.
Right.
And there's a lot of really terrific new cars being built that I think will age extremely well. It's in many cases, it's the same things that have made cars collectible, you know, throughout the history of the auto industry. Cars that are beautiful, cars that are a little bit rare, that, you know, not necessarily a car that they build 500,000 of, and cars that are fun to drive. So cars like the high performance version of the current Mustang, the GT350. There's virtually no way on earth that that's not going to be a collectible car.
Right.
The little Alfa Romeo 4C that was the vehicle, the car that Fiat Chrysler reintroduced Alfa Romeo to America with. It's gorgeous. It's phenomenally advanced, and they only sold 1,500 of them last year. So those will be collectible for sure. And there are some models that you look at, and you simply know there'll always be a desire for them. I don't think anybody has ever lost money on a Corvette. You know, Corvettes just accumulate like value like a U.S. savings bond, it seems.
Yeah. I'm looking at the list of cars that you mentioned specifically in a recent article, and you mentioned the Ford Focus RS. Now, when you talk about cars that are collectible in the future, I think probably Corvette and Mustang and those names come up, but Focus?
An excellent point, and that's part of the beauty of the fact that the automakers have sort of combined all of their global operations so that they're building many of the same cars around the world. The Focus RS is a 350 horsepower all-wheel drive version of the Focus.
Oh, my.
And they won't sell enough of them in America to justify the huge expense in developing it and building it. But if you put together the number that they'll sell in America with the number they'll sell in Europe and Asia and South America, there's a business case for it. So for the first time ever, we've got a Focus that can compete with, you know, legendary, you know, compacts like the Mitsubishi Evo and the Subaru WRX. You know, this is a car that really belongs in a video game, and you're going to be able to walk into any Ford dealer and buy it.
Well, yeah, if you, what is that, Grand Theft Auto or something, you play that, you can choose these kinds of cars that you can race with, and that really is interesting. And 350 horsepower in a Focus, that's like a rocket.
It's stunning. It really is. I mean, it's more power than you could get in a Corvette within the length of time that both you and I have been driving.
Right.
I mean, how do you even get your head around that?
Yeah. How do you keep that car on the ground? Doesn't it want to take flight?
Well, that's where the technology that we were talking about that didn't exist before comes in. It's got so many electronics to make it drivable. And in fact, it's even got an adjustable all-wheel drive system that lets you tune it for maximum handling to go around curves, or you can just flip a switch and put it in drift mode so that you're just, you know, going in circles as fast as you can, you know, like somebody in Fast and Furious.
Right. Be careful trying that in your local parking lot.
Yes.
All right, before we go, in the short time we have left, what are you looking at on the horizon that could be news in the next 6 months?
Well, the Chevy Volt, the little $30,000 electric car, will go 200 miles on a charge. That's going to be really big news. It's the car that maybe proves that the established automakers can make an electric car better than Tesla. And the Ford GT, the supercar coming from Ford, carbon fiber body, the most powerful EcoBoost engine they've ever built, and maybe the prettiest thing I've ever seen on wheels.
Yeah, it looks good. And that Bolt, it was interesting at the Detroit Auto Show, a few years ago, the Volt, with a V as in Victor, was the biggest thing in electric cars just a few years ago, was relegated to the back of the Chevrolet display, so the Bolt, with a B as in boy, could be up on the turnstile and out in front because it is such an advancement.
Exactly. Everything about it except the name, and I'm glad you spelled them. I have to get into the habit of doing that because I don't know why Chevy decided to make it so confusing for people, because those are two phenomenally interesting vehicles, and they just sound too much alike.
Right.
But you're right, the Bolt, nothing else like it on the road.
All right. Well, we'll be watching for your reports, and we always appreciate the time, Mark Phelan.
Thank you, Richard.
All right. Detroit Free Press is where you'll see Mark's reports on the auto industry and, of course, freep.com.